I want to ask you two very simple questions today. Just two. And I want you to understand something from the beginning. These are not complicated theological questions. They are historical questions. They are questions about authority. And, honestly, they are among the easiest questions I have ever asked. I have been asking them for years, to pastors, theologians, conference leaders, online presenters, and people with hundreds of thousands of followers. I have asked them in public discussions and private conversations. And despite all the responses I have received, I have yet to receive a direct answer to either question. I have received deflection. I have received theological arguments. I have received accusations. I have received personal attacks. I have even been told that I shouldn't care about historical evidence because I should simply have faith. But what I have not received is a direct answer to the question of authority. And before you hear the words fundamental principles and decide that this is just another argument about the Trinity, stay with me. Because what we're about to examine is not the usual talking point. There is a much deeper dilemma here, one that I don't think most Adventists have ever been asked to confront. Question 1. Let me first establish the foundation of the question. Ellen White repeatedly described the foundational understanding of God and His Son in very strong terms. She said, "Every pin and pillar that was established in the early days of the message was established by the Holy Spirit of God." She also wrote that God calls us to hold firmly to the fundamental principles that are based upon unquestionable authority. And in 1905 she wrote, "The personality of God and of Christ are to be everything to us as a people." She warned against theories that would remove the pillars concerning the personality of God or Christ, saying that those who did so were bringing in uncertainties and leaving the people of God without an anchor. She also said, "This foundation was built by the master worker and will stand storm and tempest." Now stop and think about the language being used here. She did not describe these foundations as merely the best theological opinion of one generation. She did not say they were provisional ideas that the church could simply replace whenever a later generation preferred a different theological framework. She used words like established by the Holy Spirit of God, unquestionable authority, and the master worker. So here's the question. If these foundational principles were established by God Himself, by the Holy Spirit of God, by the master worker, and on unquestionable authority, who later received the authority to replace them? That's the question. Not, do you believe the Trinity? Not, do you like the pioneers? Not, what is your personal theology? Who authorized the change? Because the problem becomes even more serious when you place the earlier fundamental principles beside the later fundamental beliefs. They don't merely use different wording. In important areas, they present fundamentally different theological positions. So now we have a dilemma. If the original foundation was established by God, then who had authority to replace it? But if the original foundation was wrong, then how can we say that God Himself established it? You have to resolve one side or the other. You cannot logically say, God established this foundation, and then later say, that foundation was wrong and needed to be replaced, without explaining what happened in between. Either God established it, or He didn't. And if God did establish it, then where did the authority come from to change it? That is not a small question. And here's where the dilemma becomes much bigger. Because if Ellen White was a true prophet, and she correctly described these foundational principles as having been established by the Holy Spirit and based upon unquestionable authority, then the later replacement creates a very serious problem for the modern church. But if Ellen White was wrong about this, if she was wrong about the personality of God and His Son, which she wrote about repeatedly throughout her ministry, then we have an even bigger problem. Because then we have to ask whether she was actually a true prophet at all. You can take virtually any period of her writings and find material dealing with God, Christ, and their relationship. This isn't some obscure footnote in one forgotten manuscript. So either she was a true prophet or she wasn't. If she was, then the modern church has a serious problem with what she said the Holy Spirit established. If she wasn't, then the supernatural foundation of the Advent movement itself is called into question. Think about the implications. The dilemma isn't something created by critics of Adventism. The dilemma is created by the claims themselves. And that is why simply saying, the Trinity is true, does not answer my question. You haven't answered the historical question. You haven't answered the authority question. You haven't explained how something established by God Himself could later become error. And this is where the second question becomes important. Question 2. The original fundamental principles explicitly identified the papacy in prophetic terms as the Antichrist power and the man of sin. That identification was not some insignificant side issue. It was deeply connected to the prophetic understanding that helped define the Advent movement. Yet that identification was not carried forward into the 1980 fundamental beliefs. So again, who authorized the removal? Who had the authority to take something that had been part of the movement's foundational prophetic understanding and remove it from the official statement? And notice what happens when you put these two questions together. Question 1 asks, who authorized the replacement of foundational principles concerning God and Christ? Question 2 asks, who authorized the removal of a foundational prophetic identification concerning the papacy? Different subjects, same underlying question. Where did the authority come from? And this is where I think many Adventists have never really considered the implications. Most members are simply told what the church believes today. They are presented with the current fundamental beliefs and expected to accept them as the official standard. But how many have actually gone back and compared them with the original fundamental principles? How many have asked why they changed? How many have asked who authorized those changes? And perhaps most importantly, how many have asked whether a church organization has the authority to replace something that it claims God Himself established? Because once you ask that question, another question follows. If the earlier position was wrong, why was it presented as something established by the Holy Spirit? And if the earlier position was right, why was it changed? You cannot simply answer both ways. That is where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. And this is also where the issue of cognitive dissonance enters the picture. We are being asked to accept two contradictory positions as though they can both represent truth. The older foundation is described as established by God. The newer position rejects important aspects of that foundation. Yet we are expected to accept both the claim that God established the earlier foundation and the claim that the later church was right to replace it. Something has to give. And this is why the question of Ellen White becomes so important. If she was a true prophet, then what she said about the foundation cannot simply be brushed aside, because a later generation decided to change direction. But if she was wrong on something as fundamental as the personality of God and His Son, then we need to be honest about what that means. You can't have it both ways. And this is precisely why I don't think most Adventists realize the true dilemma created by these two simple questions. Because these aren't two isolated questions. They open a labyrinth. One question leads to another, then another, then another. And suddenly you are no longer discussing one doctrine. You're discussing authority. You're discussing prophecy. You're discussing history. You're discussing changes to the official beliefs. You're discussing how historical information has been presented or not presented to ordinary members. You're discussing what happens when a movement changes the very platform it once claimed God established. And then you have to ask a very uncomfortable question. Why were these questions never placed in front of the ordinary Adventist sitting in the pew? Because if these questions can be answered easily, then answer them. If the modern position is correct, establish it from the evidence. If the historical record supports the changes, show us the record. If there is divine authorization, show us the authorization. But if the questions cannot be answered, then why are people expected to simply trust the system? And perhaps this explains something else. Where can we find confidence in the modern Adventist message when fundamental historical questions like these remain unanswered? And then people wonder why some eventually lose confidence in Ellen White. It should not come as a surprise. If a church claims to believe a prophet was genuinely sent by God, but then appears to move away from some of the very foundations that prophet said were established by the Holy Spirit, people are naturally going to start asking questions. And I have to ask myself another question. Was this intentional? I am not asking you to accept my answer. You be the judge. Go back to the documents. Study the history. Examine what was written, what was changed, what was omitted, who was involved, and what happened when these issues were raised. Because that's exactly what I did. And what I discovered was far more extensive than I initially expected. At first, I thought I was dealing with separate problems. One historical question here, one doctrinal question there, a quotation that seemed difficult to explain, a change in a book, a decision made at a particular time, a statement that appeared to contradict something written earlier. But the further I went, the stranger it became. The questions began connecting. And eventually, I had to ask myself a question that I could no longer escape. What if these aren't separate problems at all? What if they are pieces of the same story? I don't want to tell you what conclusion you should reach. And I certainly don't claim that I have everything figured out. I've had to change my own conclusions many times as I've discovered evidence I hadn't seen before. But I will tell you this. When you take the entire body of evidence seriously, not just the parts that support what you already believe, you begin to see something that is very difficult to unsee. Questions that seemed unrelated begin to answer one another. And conclusions that seemed impossible at the beginning suddenly begin to make sense of the evidence. That is what I found. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all is this. What if the answer to these questions has been sitting in the historical record all along, but we were never given the complete record from which to find it? If that possibility bothers you, good. Don't believe me. Investigate it. Because there is only one way to find out. And that's where the deeper questions begin. The two questions I've given you today are the easy ones. There are much harder questions waiting behind them. And when you begin following those questions through the original documents, the historical record, the changes, the omissions, the contradictions, and the testimonies of the people who were actually there, you eventually reach a point where you have to make a choice. Do I follow the evidence, even if it takes me somewhere I never expected to go? Or do I stop investigating when the evidence becomes uncomfortable? That's the decision every serious seeker of truth eventually has to make. We each have to stand before God one day. So here's something you can do. Take these two questions and put them in front of someone you trust. A pastor, a theologian, a conference leader, someone who is absolutely convinced that the modern position is correct. Don't tell them what answer you want. Just ask them to answer the questions directly. Who authorized the change? And how can something established by God Himself later be called error? Then watch what happens. Do they answer the question? Or do they change the subject? Do they examine the evidence? Or do they question your motives? Do they deal with the contradiction? Or do they simply defend the system that created it? That, in itself, may tell you more than you expected that I have documented the trail I followed in the redacted archives. Not so that you can simply accept my conclusions, but so that you can walk the trail yourself. Check the sources. Challenge the conclusions. Try to prove it wrong. And if you discover something I missed, then follow that evidence too. Because ultimately, this isn't about proving me right. I honestly have no stake in being validated. It's about finding out what is true. And perhaps you will discover something else along the way. Something I haven't told you in this video. Because there is a question I deliberately have not answered for you. What conclusion explains all of these contradictions at the same time? Not one contradiction. Not two. All of them. I want you to discover that for yourself. Because once you start pulling that thread, you may be surprised at just how much comes with it. The trail is there. The documents are there. The questions are there. And the evidence is there. The only question left is whether we are willing to follow it. And perhaps the best way to find out is very simple. Take these two questions to someone who believes they already know the answer and see what happens.